Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reski.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, so one of the things I see happening here, and Randy, you're welcome to comment, is Peter was a broken man. So Peter was, we've already talked about how courageous he was, how committed he was. He was one of the most committed disciples. I mean, yeah, he stuck his foot in his mouth, he made mistakes, but at the end of the day, even when Jesus was arrested, I mean, he was the only one who pulled out his sword and was willing to defend and try to keep Jesus from being arrested. Now, again, at this point, he doesn't really understand that Jesus needs to go to the cross and that he's not a physical, he's not a political figure that's going to save the Jews. He's a spiritual savior that needs to die for our sins. He didn't understand that. So, but you see his tremendous commitment and courage, but then he's incredibly broken because he denies Christ. And the thing that he said he would never do, he did. And so what I see here in this passage is when he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. It's like what Peter's saying to Jesus is, Peter's got himself to a point where he's like, Jesus, you know me better than I know myself. And you know that I love you. And, look at the third time in verse 17, it says, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. So basically he's come to a point in his life, it's kind of a new level of spiritual maturity. And this is what I'm wondering if you guys can relate to, is that he's recognizing that Jesus knows him better than he knows himself. Because he thought he knew himself. He thought he would never deny Jesus. He thought he would never, he was the most committed. But then he becomes broken because he does the one thing that he said he would never do. So now he's come to a new point where he realizes that, God, you know me better than I know myself. Have you guys ever thought of that? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead.
I feel like that is not just for Peter, but for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
We think like you know what's going on in your heart right now, right? I know what's going on in my heart right now. Nobody else knows, but God knows. So God, not just Peter, but pretty much Jesus knew everybody better than they knew themselves. And that's one of the reasons why he pointed him out that, when you grow older, you're gonna be where you don't want to be. So he knew it. He could. That's what I was talking about earlier. That's why Jesus was such a great teacher, because he knew what's going to happen. But he came down to the level of the other person's understanding to explain them in the best way possible, instead of just like throwing all the information at once on them. That would like overwhelm everybody. So I think that's how I feel about it. Pretty much God knows us the best. Even the things that we don't know right now, because we cannot see the future, right? You cannot see the future, but probably God knows what's going to happen to us tomorrow.
So, but all throughout the Bible, we see people that think that they can, like Jonah, for example, he thought he could run away from God. He thought, God tells him, I want you to go to Nineveh and preach, against that city. And he goes the opposite direction. And he actually thinks he can run away from God. But it's just an interesting thought that Peter got himself to a new level. It's almost like he leveled up in his spiritual beliefs that, Jesus, you know me way better than I know myself.
Mhm.
And you know that I love you. Randy, you were going to make a comment a few minutes ago.
Well, yeah, I just think if you go back when Jesus reinstates them back to the Last Supper, before they go to Gethsemane in Matthew 26, Peter replies. Jesus tells Peter, "You're gonna this very night you will fall away on account of me." And Peter says, "Even if all fall away on account of me, I never will." He's comparing himself to everybody else. And I think when Jesus is reinstating him with that first time, it's because he does know him better. He's like, "Hey, Peter, do you still think you're better than everybody else?" Like he's saying, "Do you love me more than all of these?" He only asked that once. And I think it's because he's literally almost going back to that Last Supper and saying to Peter, "Peter, remember when you said that even if everyone else falls away, you wouldn't?" Like, and so he's giving him a chance to reinstate himself, to come back, to claim that he wants to follow Christ. And one other quick thing I think is really significant is Jesus says over and over, he doesn't say feed your lambs. He says feed my lambs, feed my sheep, and that we are all his sheep. So he's not saying, and so sometimes people involved in ministry see the folks as these are my people, my church or my ministry. And Jesus is saying, no, they're all mine. This is my lambs, the ones I care for. These are the ones I love. And so, Peter, take care of the ones that I love. And I love that. It's my sheep, my lambs, yeah.
Yeah, that is really cool. And that kind of reminds me of when they caught the 153 fish. Those were, in a sense, those were Jesus's fish too.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this. Like when he says, feed my lambs, sometimes this kind of reminds me a little bit about John chapter 3, when he had this conversation with Nicodemus. And, sometimes Jesus's responses can be confusing. So he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And then Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Why did Jesus say to feed his lambs? Obviously you just brought up the point that they're his lambs. And this kind of ties into maybe the argument that when he said, "Do you love me more than these?" he's referring to the fish, because he's now saying, "I don't want you to love fish anymore. I want you to love my lambs, which are my people." And then, do you guys have any thoughts on it? He says, "Feed my lambs" the first time. Then he says, "Take care of my sheep." And then the third time he says, "Feed my sheep." What's happening there is Jesus is not just reinstating Peter, but is he recommissioning him?
Yeah. And I think for them, understand, throughout the scripture, for David was a shepherd. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. I think the nation of Israel understood that. I think these men understood when he's saying this. In many ways, Jesus is actually claiming to be God. The God is the shepherd. And Jesus said, "These are my sheep. These are my people, my lambs. These are the ones I love." And so I think you lay down your life for your sheep. And so, yeah, I think I think he's commissioning him back into ministry. He's saying, you're gonna spend time taking care of people and feeding them my word. So yes, but I think the people at the time, that the idea of sheep and lambs was not formed. That's the Old Testament's filled with passages like that. So I think they would have understood that.
Yeah. All right, well, let's continue on. There's only a little bit more left in this passage, in this chapter. So he, in verse 19, he indicates oh yeah, we should talk about this for a second. Jesus tells Peter how he's going to die, which is kind of crazy. He says in verse 18, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, which stretching out your hands is like being on the cross, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate what kind of death Peter would glorify God. Yeah. So Randy, what do we know about how Peter died?
Well, as history tells us, Peter died. He was crucified, and he was crucified. He chose, rather than to be crucified the way that Jesus did, he chose, his church history tells us that he was crucified upside down, that he felt like he wasn't good enough to die the way Jesus did. So he asked to be crucified upside down, which I've even tried to picture how that would have looked. But yeah, that's what church history tells us.
Yeah. And that's crazy. So then it goes on, and he says in verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate what kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. And then what does Peter do? And this is classic Peter right here. It really is classic Peter. I think he was a verbal processor. I think he just kind of spoke what came to his mind, which that's the way I am too. I mean,
Yeah.
Where my wife, when she speaks, she's thought through what she's going to say, and she's very wise. Where I will process out loud, I will say things, and then 2 minutes later, I'll disagree with it. So anyway, Peter turns in verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, which was John, was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Which is so funny that Peter did this. I mean, it's just so funny that. And then Jesus answered in verse 22, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, a rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? And then John talks about himself here. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. And then I love verse 25, and it's the last verse of the book of the Gospel of John. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room for the books that would be written.
Oh,
that is a really cool verse. So in other words, Jesus did, when we read the Gospels, we don't have every single thing that Jesus did. We only have a small portion of it, just a tiny bit. But let's go back to this, like Peter's response, and says, what about him? What are you guys' thoughts on this?
I think, Greg, in a Bible I have, it's a quote by Chuck Swindoll, but it says, we really are only responsible to answer for ourselves. Like we're not to worry about what other people do or we're only to do the role that God has for us, not the role God has. And sometimes we can look at each other and say, it's not fair. Like, how come they get that and I don't? Or how come everything's better for them? And our job is to do the role that God has prepared for us to do, and not to compare to everyone else, but to think through, what is it you want me to do, God? What is my role here to do? How can I bring you glory and please you? And we answer only for ourselves.
Yeah.
And so when we stand before God, have we done what he asked us to do? And so I think because Peter keeps, like I said, all the way back in Matthew, where he was saying, hey, they can all follow me, but I won't. He kept comparing himself. And then he says, well, here he's comparing himself again. And it's like, and Jesus is saying, hey, stop. Just focus on who
Just
you're.
follow me.
Yeah.
Follow me, because he wants to set Peter free from the comparison game.
Right.
He wants
Amen.
to set people free from, because if you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, you're always going to compare yourself to people that are more successful, more, have more things, have more money, have more, but we're each running our own race. And like you said, like for us to really be set free, we need to just focus on Jesus. What do you think about that, Ali?
So I think that's very true, right? Because it's just the human nature that we end up comparing, because I feel like we compare because we feel like we have not achieved as much as the other person has achieved. So I think that's one of the reasons why we compare, and that's what really, makes Jesus special. That he gives you, he treats every person as an individual and never compares, because that's how it should be in life. You can like, and this is an old example that my mom used to give to me, where you look at your hand and not all the fingers are equal, but all of them are equally important. The things that the index finger can do, maybe this cannot do, but what this can do, this cannot do. So I think that's how I look at it.
That's a great illustration there.
I agree, Ali. I think you're right. I think that is human nature. But sadly, when we compare and everything to everybody else, so if I'm constantly comparing myself to you, and you have this incredible thing that happens in your life that's so great, instead of me being able to celebrate it, I'm bummed that it didn't happen to me because I'm busy comparing. And so when we're free of that, I can actually celebrate with you and enjoy your success because I'm free from it. I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's not like you're not my competitor, you're my friend, and I want you to succeed as much as myself. And I think for us as followers of Christ, we want, think of others as more important than yourselves, is what Paul says in Philippians. And I think that's a great illustration of this, that we get to think about others and lift them up more than ourselves. So, yeah, but I think you're right. It is part of our nature. And sadly,
Yes.
I think Jesus can set us free from that.
Yeah, I mean, even for a very long time, even I compared myself to my other class fellows or my other friends. You always end up comparing. And I think it's, in some ways, it's just human nature that you end up comparing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So when you read that statement, when you read verse 22, it can seem a little harsh. If I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. But I think it's sort of a compassionate statement too, because he's basically saying, like I was saying before, Peter, for you to be the best version of yourself, you need to focus on me and not other people.
Yes. Yep. I think that's how it should be looked at. But it's also about, like, if you look at it, Jesus is saying that, if it doesn't matter me, it should not matter to you, right? So you follow me, you care about me, you don't care about what everybody else is doing. It's just like, like I said before, he accounts for everybody individually, just because he doesn't let the other person influence his decision because of that. And I think it's just like typical human nature to do that, right? We see that example every day, especially now that I am in a class setting. I see that example even more, where the professor is like, trying to teach somebody, and then every now and then the other student kind of intervenes, and then the professor has to become a great leveler to make every other student feel equally important, although they're not. I mean, some are more smart, some are, not as smart, but the job of the professor is to level everybody. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here in some ways.
That's true. And here's another interesting observation. In verse 23, it says, because of this, a rumor spread among the believers that the disciple would not die. This was a conversation between 8 people. There were the 7 disciples and Jesus. And isn't it interesting that how this spread? Like this conversation spread, it became known, so that it became this huge rumor that this disciple John, who wrote the book Gospel of John, that he wasn't going to die, that he was going to somehow just keep living until Jesus returned. I find that kind of fascinating. And again, when people tell you that the Bible is just a bunch of made up stories, why would you put that in there unless it happened? Like, it was such a well-known rumor that John put it in there because, people were still talking about it. So I think that's interesting. Any thoughts, Randy?
Well, no, not necessarily anything new, but I think it's interesting to me how in the scriptures, if you were trying to write something and make something up, you would probably paint yourself in a really positive light. Like you would want to show yourself to be, yet the disciples don't always come off and they show who they really are, right? I mean, Peter is so compulsive and he says things and he jumps in and, he jumps in the water and he starts to sink. And there's Thomas doubts him and it goes on, right? There's all James and John asked if they could sit on his right and his left. There's all these scenes like that. And I think to me, that just shows the reliability of the scriptures, that these people are not trying to put a fake. It's not like everything on Facebook's a happy picture of something incredible in my life. That's not really how life is. And I love how they write exactly who they are. And,
because like we said, so Peter goes through this whole thing about how much he loves Jesus, and Jesus gently reinstates him and recommissions him, but then he turns around 2 seconds later and says, well, what about him? Like it's why if and then Peter is like the superhero in the book of Acts. So you still see that Peter is just a flawed human being, just like you and I are. Well, let's wrap this up and look at the last verse 25. I think this is fascinating. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the whole world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Isn't that an amazing verse? So what he's saying is, while John wrote the truth about Jesus, it was impossible for him to write the whole truth about Jesus.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for how long did Jesus live on this planet?
Randy?
how long did he live?
Yeah, how long did he live? Does anybody know that?
Yeah, I mean
33 years.
33 and a half years. Yeah.
Because I think my question is kind of related to this passage, because for those 33 years, I think he must have done a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
but the first 30 years of his life, Ali, he was sort of hidden.
A normal
was-
human.
Yeah, he was like a carpenter, and he wasn't, it was only the last 3 years of his life where he made himself known to the world. But I mean, obviously this statement is like what is it? Hyperbole?
Exaggerated? Is that what you're trying to say?
It's like a hyperbole. It's exaggerated, but I think it's also not exaggerated because we know that Jesus existed before he became human. He's always existed in eternity. And so in that sense,
I mean, yeah, he's doing things right now.
I mean, you can't
Right, yes.
you can't write enough books about God to explain him,
Yep.
There's so much about God that we don't know.
That is true. That is, I always say that because I think God has only given us that much intelligence, right? His existence and his being. I feel like, when sometimes people ask critical questions about God and they try and find answers which they cannot find, I feel like you got to give that and you got to say that that's above my pay grade.
Yeah.
Because you cannot understand that part because God has not given you the intelligence to understand that part.
So I think that part of what he's saying here, this last verse, is that there's much more about Jesus than we know.
That's true.
And so it's okay for us as followers of Jesus, when somebody asks us a question, to say, I don't know. Like, we don't have to have all the answers because there's so much about Jesus that I still don't know.
Yes.
I'm still learning.
Yeah.
Like I still need to keep following Jesus because there's not you never get to the point where you come to the point in your life where you're like, I know everything about Jesus. That's impossible.
Yes. I mean, if you just look at nature, right? There are so many things in nature that you can explain how they're happening. Science can explain how they're happening, but they cannot explain why they're happening. I think that is beyond our intelligence. You cannot understand that. That's God's work, and you leave it at that. That's how I feel about it. Like,
I've heard that scientists the scientists that are experts in like the microscopic stuff, that most of them are believers in God. And also the scientists that examine the macro stuff, like the stars and the universe, they tend to be believers in God.
Yeah. I mean, so, the other day I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and I was like, God knew that we're going to need water. I think water is one of the greatest gifts of God. I mean, just look at water. How much do we depend on water in everyday life? We drink it, we use it to clean ourselves, right? Water goes in our food. Without water, there would be no plants, so we cannot have food. So how did God come up with this? Who can come up with this idea? I don't think a human can come up with an idea to create water. God created water, right? It can only be a super being like him who could think of water, and he could think that if I'm putting people on this planet, they're going to need water.
And you know what? Our bodies are 70% water, so that means we're this close to drowning.
Holly, don't laugh. Don't laugh,
it's a good one.
Oh no.
We're this close to drowning.
No, we heard it the first time, Greg. No,
All right.
But I was going to say, here's an amazing thing, Holly. Think about this with water. Water is so unique. It's the only element, I believe, that in its solid form, it floats. So, like everything else in the solid form, it'll sink. So, water, 3 forms: gas, vapor, solid, ice. Ice floats. If ice did not float, it would sink to the bottom, build up, and all life on this planet would not exist. Right. Because within a few years, the entire planet will be frozen. Yeah. But because ice floats, it doesn't go down to the bottom, it doesn't stay frozen, and so it will melt. And so that means that there can be life on the planet. And it's like someone even thought of that.
You see, that is like beyond a human mind cannot think that far. It has to be God. So, that's like every now and then I get into an argument, not an argument, but like I get into a discussion with people who are not believers. I tell them, just look around you. Like, just one day, wake up in the morning and look around you. And the creation that you're living in has you yourself as a wonder. Of course, God created all of us. But if you just look around yourself, you have to believe in God. There's no way you can deny God. Just look around you. All this has been created by God. And it's just perfect because everything that we need exists on this planet. And he knew that.
That's great. That's a great that's a great way to look at life. And yeah, I have a friend who said a similar thing. He goes, whenever I start feel like I'm far from God, I just look at my hand. I just stare at my hand, and I just think all that went into making my fingers move and the intricacies of the human hand are just crazy, and in the human eyeball. And there's just so much you can marvel at. And I remember actually, Ali, before you started following Jesus, you and I used to talk a lot about nature.
Yes.
And
I'm a nature lover.
Yeah. Well, and what impressed me is how you saw God in nature.
Yes. Because I think that's one, and we being ourselves, one of his greatest creation, right? Humans have not been able to emulate a human being yet, and I don't think they'll ever be able to create another human being. But that's how I look at it. If you people ask for proofs, right? People ask, so prove me that God exists. You just have to look at yourself in the mirror, or even if that's not enough, you just look up in the sky. Who else can create such a wonder? It has to be God. It has to be a higher power. I mean, if calling him God is too far, you have to believe that we are on this planet and there is a reason, and there's a creator. You cannot deny the fact that there's not a creator for all of this.
Amen. So with that, I'm just that last verse, and there are also so many other things that Jesus did, which if they were recorded one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.